Hello, and welcome to Dr. Mercola's Cellular Wisdom, the show where we dissect health myths with a scalpel and a smile. I'm Ethan Foster, your resident observer of the human condition, always on the lookout for intriguing facts and the occasional bizarre health fad.
And I'm Alara Skye, known to some as the comedic gatekeeper of natural health truths. I like to think of myself as the surgical blade in this equation, sharp, precise, and occasionally mistaken for a letter opener.
Together, we're here to delight you with dry humor, bright commentary, and a dash of cellular brilliance that you didn't know you needed.
Now, today's episode is about something near and dear to all of us, which is actually not a seat sail to Hawaii, though I do love a bargain. We're talking about sleep, and more specifically, the hidden threat that sleep deprivation poses to our personal and collective health.
I can already sense the audience sitting up a little straighter. This is cellular wisdom, after all, and we're obligated to deliver the goods, and maybe some witty asides.
Right. The brand promise is cut through myths with a scalpel and a smile. So let's not disappoint. But before we fully dive into the land of dreams, we've got some exciting news. Dr. Mercola's new book is now a bestseller.
I love bestsellers. They're the only kind of books that make it into my house these days. It's like a built-in stamp of approval, so I can feel better about pretending I'll eventually read them.
And this book is all about cellular health, which is basically the foundation of everything we do, think, and even the way we look at the world. Every bodily function we have, be it sneezing or pondering the meaning of life, has its roots at the cellular level.
Dr. Mercola's been on this mission a long time, shining a bright light on the underappreciated corners of our health. It's no surprise that, in between major announcements and new articles, sleep ended up topping his list of public health threats.
Sleep might be the ultimate underdog in the health conversation. Everyone talks about diet and exercise. They're like the loud, popular kids in high school. Meanwhile, sleep is that quiet kid in the corner who's been proving crucial for your survival. Only you rarely notice.
It's always the quiet ones.
Precisely. So, let's jump into the story at hand. Sleep deprivation is no joke. According to recent analyses and research, some from Dr. Mercola himself, sleep deprivation can increase your risk of catching influenza by a staggering 54%.
54%. That's not exactly a small margin of error. If someone told me that by sleeping an extra hour a night I could cut my risk of the flu by half, I'd be reaching for my pillow right now.
You'd think that alone would inspire a national bedtime, like an official order. Citizens, to your bedrooms at 10 p.m. sharp. But we've yet to see that legislative approach.
Perhaps it's not quite as captivating as building roads and bridges. But if we consider how sleep links directly to the immune system, it might actually do wonders for society's overall health.
The research cited by Dr. Mercola references how individuals got significantly less sleep than usual during certain national events. These folks ended up with a much higher risk of flu-related healthcare visits. It's a great reminder that stressful events and big news stories can rob us of our rest, and apparently of our immune superpowers.
That's the hidden threat. People assume if they're stressed, the main issue is just feeling anxious, but the chain reaction is so much more extensive. Sleep gets disrupted, immune defenses drop, and viruses see an open door with a welcome sign.
It's basically a multi-step handshake for disease. But let's talk about Dr. Matthew Walker. He's been called one of the most recognized sleep experts today, and Dr. Mercola highlighted his viewpoint in a big way.
Walker says sleep is our life support system, and as best we can tell, it might just be nature's best attempt at immortality.
Immortality? That's a big claim. But if you think about it, if there's any secret sauce that helps your body keep everything in check, memory, immune function, emotional regulation, the potential delay of neurodegenerative decline, sleep is that sauce.
So, in other words, if you see a ketchup bottle that says sleep, you better put it on everything. Exactly. Just don't try to drizzle actual ketchup on your bed, or you might have bigger problems than a missed night's rest.
Exactly. Just don't try to drizzle actual ketchup on your bed, or you might have bigger problems than a missed night's rest.
Moving on, I like big picture stats, so here's one that stands out. Insufficient sleep costs many nations up to billions of dollars annually, like a huge chunk of their GDP. We're talking hundreds of billions in total.
Right. In the United States alone, some folks have estimated that number to be around $400 billion. Japan, the UK, they're all dealing with massive losses tied to productivity dips, healthcare expenses, and all sorts of flow-on effects from a sleep-deprived population.
If I were a cynic, I'd say if a multi-billion-dollar corporation realized they were losing that much money due to poor sleep, they'd issue bedtime mandates for employees.
Maybe that's the wave of the future. Picture mandatory nap pods in every office, with security guards who gently lull you to sleep at your scheduled break time. It might sound futuristic, but given the data, it's not that crazy.
Now, let's talk specifics. Sleep is so multifaceted that it's like the Swiss Army knife of health. Emotional regulation? Check. Metabolism and weight management? Check. Immune resilience? Check. And let's not forget the biggie, memory and learning.
Walker says that sleep fixates memories, helping you store what you've learned. Then, once it's all stored, It helps you connect the dots so you can transform information into wisdom. Because knowledge is knowing that tomatoes are fruit. Wisdom is not putting them in fruit salad.
Exactly. Or is that comedic observation?
Possibly comedic wisdom. Now, with Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative conditions looming large in public awareness, Walker's highlight about sleep's brain cleansing effect is huge. He points out that during deep sleep, your brain actually washes away toxic proteins that contribute to Alzheimer's.
That might be the best housekeeping service we'll ever have. While we do absolutely nothing but doze off, the brain's glymphatic system power washes all the bad stuff away.
And that housekeeping is unbelievably crucial. Because when you skip sleep, you don't just lose a bit of pep in your step. You lose out on that scrubbing process that could be essential in preventing or delaying cognitive decline.
So, to put it bluntly, shorting yourself on sleep is like opting out of nightly housekeeping in a hotel room where you're living long term. Eventually, things pile up in all the corners.
Precisely. Now let's shift from the reason sleep is so vital to some ideas Dr. Mercola and others have put forward for improving it. Because we can't just say, go to bed early, and call it a day.
One piece of advice from Walker is not to linger in bed in the morning. Get up within 30 minutes of waking, because if you spend too long awake in bed, your brain builds an association that bed is where I lie wide awake, mentally writing my to-do list. That, ironically, can make insomnia worse.
So the old advice, just lay there until you fall asleep, might not be the best. The brain is a quick study in forming associations. If it learns that bed is ground zero for tossing and turning, that association can set in firmly.
Another strategy that often pops up is to get at least 10 to 15 minutes of sunlight first thing in the morning. Since you're not a snake, assuming you're not listening to this from the reptile enclosure, your body needs that natural light to reset your internal clock.
And if you're a vampire, well, I can't help you there. But for the rest of us, bright morning sunlight is a strong message to your brain. Daytime has arrived. You may now proceed with caffeinated beverages responsibly.
Let's not forget the other classic strategies: consistent bedtimes, a dark and cool sleep environment, and an evening wind-down routine that signals to your mind and body it's time to check out for the night.
Yes. Dr. Mercola has a top 33 tips to optimize your sleep routine, but we can't recite them all in detail, so let's focus on the big highlights. The first is a consistent sleep schedule. Weekends, holidays, birthdays, try to keep that bedtime more or less the same. It helps with circadian rhythm alignment.
The second is a pitch-black bedroom. Once the sun is down, your body's expecting darkness, but we still have lights from screens, neon signs, bedside alarm clocks that glow like nuclear beacons.
Yes, we do love our gadgets, but all that light, especially LED or blue light, can disrupt melatonin production. And if your brain can't produce enough melatonin, it's like removing the central director of your sleep orchestra.
Next, temperature. Many experts say that the sweet spot for sleep is somewhere in the mid-60 degrees Fahrenheit range. Some say 65 to 68 degrees. That helps replicate the natural drop in body temperature that fosters deeper rest.
Finally, that oh-so-important wind-down routine. For at least 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, try not to do anything super physical or super mentally engaging. It's a chance to let your mind switch gears. That might mean reading, stretching, or mentally replaying your day in a calm way.
Dr. Mercola also mentions how certain dietary factors can affect sleep, from carbohydrate intake to protein ratios. There's a sweet spot for how many carbs we need. If you go too low or too high, it can mess with your energy at night.
Meanwhile, a moderate protein intake is typically recommended, about 0.8 grams of protein per pound of lean body mass, but obviously that can vary for each individual. The main point is that fueling your body in a balanced way helps avoid nighttime disruptions like blood sugar dips that can rattle you awake.
I've definitely experienced that. Wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, rummaging for a snack I didn't know I needed.
Exactly. And while we're talking about rummaging, Dr. Mercola suggests steering clear of heavy evening meals or intense exercise right before bed. If you're powering through a CrossFit routine at 9:45 at night, you might have trouble dozing off.
Now, there's a mention of pharmaceutical-grade methylene blue. That one might raise some eyebrows for folks who haven't heard of it, but Dr. Mercola has discussed it in terms of supporting mitochondrial function.
Yes, though, that's something individuals would typically approach carefully and with professional guidance. The idea is that it might help with cellular energy processes, but it's not something you casually toss in your grocery cart next to the cheddar cheese.
Unless your grocery store is much more interesting than mine. The big takeaway is that certain targeted supplements or methods can help your sleep, but they're not a one-size-fits-all solution. Understanding your own body is key.
And do note, consistent healthy habits usually go further than the quick fix approach. A dark room, a stable schedule, minimal stress, that's half the battle right there.
Now, regarding sleep deprivation and public health, the conversation is often overshadowed by other big health news. But Dr. Mercola cites it as a genuine emergency, like, we might want to get the sirens going.
I can imagine them now. Woo-woo, get yourself to bed. But comedic imagery aside, there's a serious point here. When huge portions of the population are sleep deprived, that increases the load on hospitals, workplaces, and economies in general.
Plus, you can't measure what you don't track. Most people know if they're short on sleep, but they don't always realize how consistent or severe that shortfall is. We just keep plugging along, fueling ourselves with coffee.
Yes, coffee. The universal bandage for not enough pillow time. But that bandage eventually stops working if the root cause, lack of sleep, never gets addressed.
I recall reading that about 1/3 of the global population isn't getting the recommended 7 to 9 hours. That's a large chunk of humanity forging ahead on a deficit. That suggests we've got a cultural issue, not just an individual one.
Indeed, especially when you factor in high-tech gadgets that keep us awake at night, or the digital news cycle that keeps us stressed or outraged. We end up in these cycles of doom scrolling at 11 p.m., then we wonder why we feel like zombies the next day.
Doom scrolling is basically the bedtime boogeyman of the modern era.
Perfect analogy. But we also can't ignore the genetic aspect. Some people do have a predisposition to needing less sleep, but the key word there is some. That's a small group, and many are walking around claiming that label without genetic proof.
Right? Being that lucky short sleeper is fairly rare. Everyone else is basically just telling themselves a bedtime story about needing less rest. Not the best approach to health.
Meanwhile, if people do catch something, like the flu, lack of sleep might tip them from just a mild case to a full-blown meltdown requiring serious intervention.
That's the inconvenient truth. If your immune system is running on low battery, the viruses out there see an easy target. So maybe that's the impetus we need. Want to avoid a nasty bout of the flu. Prioritize sleep. It's not exactly rocket science, but evidently it's easy to ignore.
I suppose rocket scientists probably need their sleep too, or else we might see some questionable rocket trajectories.
Yes, indeed. Now, from a comedic angle, I love how this entire conversation basically positions your mattress as the ultimate health device. Forget expensive gear, just a comfortable bed, a quiet room, no bright lights, and a halfway decent schedule might do more for you than half the pricey options out there.
It's beautifully simple, right? Though the real challenge is implementing these simple solutions in a world that thrives on hustle and busyness.
Right? I'll sleep when I'm dead is a common phrase for overachievers. The problem is that might come sooner than they think if they truly skip sleep long term.
Morbid, but yes. Now, Dr. Mercola also emphasizes stress management. Because if your mind is racing when your head hits the pillow, plotting the next day's tasks or rehashing arguments you had at breakfast, sleep can be elusive.
Indeed, stress is basically the big boulder in the middle of the highway to dreamland. That's where meditation, journaling, or gentle yoga can help. I've also heard of progressive muscle relaxation, systematically tensing and releasing muscles from head to toe.
That's a good one. Another angle is environment. Some folks live in noisy apartments or next to highways. That can be tough. But there are white noise machines or earplugs. Darkness can be achieved with blackout curtains. We might just have to get creative.
Creativity for better rest? I like the sound of that. And if your phone screen is the last thing you look at each night, maybe switch to an actual physical book or an e-ink reader without that bright blue light shining in your face.
I do wonder if a novel about restful beaches or the ocean might lull me off faster than a random thriller. Probably so. Another subtle point Dr. Mercola touched on is how sleep can help with weight management. If you sleep less, you lose more muscle mass than fat if you go on a diet. That's a pretty big revelation.
So, in other words, you can be dieting all you want, but if you're not well rested, you're going to lose the stuff you want to keep, and keep the stuff you want to lose. It's the ultimate cosmic joke on those who skip sleep.
Indeed. And that's also tied into metabolic health and blood sugar regulation. In one sense, good sleep is the best personal trainer you never knew you had.
Right, Coach Pillow. That's got a nice ring to it.
Let's also mention the emotional aspect. Walker points out sleep can reduce anxiety and emotional reactivity. So if you're feeling edgy and want to snap at your coworker, maybe what you need is an extra hour of slumber rather than a dozen conflict resolution meetings.
And it's cheaper too, unless you're paying for a fancy memory foam mattress. Even then, it might still be cheaper than daily therapy for an entire department.
And that's not a knock on therapy, of course. It's just recognizing that insomnia or chronic sleep deprivation can be a root contributor to so many emotional and psychological stressors.
Now, let's circle back to Dr. Mercola's emphasis on influenza risk. We talked about the risk rising by over 50% if you're severely sleep deprived. That's a major statistic. It's not just about the sniffles, it's about potential complications, especially for vulnerable populations.
The elderly, children, those with compromised immunity. If you're not letting your body recharge every night, you're opening the door wide for viruses to come marching in.
That's presumably part of why Dr. Mercola calls acute sleep deprivation a public health emergency. Big events, major crises, or anything else that leads an entire population to lose sleep can have ripple effects in hospitals and clinics.
Imagine if there's a huge event that causes anxiety on a national scale, then everyone's up late watching the news. 3 days later, the clinics see a spike in flu cases. The connection makes sense when you see how immune function is tied to rest.
So it's not just about wearing the right gear or washing your hands thoroughly, although that's definitely helpful. It's also about hitting the hay on time.
People might roll their eyes at that, but the science is there. Let's talk about the interplay of cytokines and antibodies. When you're sleep deprived, your cytokine production is compromised. That might sound esoteric, but cytokines are crucial for fighting infections.
Exactly. And on top of that, your antibody production also suffers, so you can't neutralize pathogens as effectively. So the microinvaders get the upper hand.
So if you're banking on your immune system, you better make sure your bank has some robust deposits in the form of nightly rest. Otherwise, you might find it's bankrupt just when you need it the most.
Well put. Now, turning away from immunity, let's not forget about the link to mental well-being. Walker discusses how proper sleep can reduce emotional difficulties and dampen anxiety. I think it's brilliant that the same remedy that helps prevent the flu also helps you keep your cool in stressful situations.
Talk about a multi-pronged solution. No wonder sleep has stuck around evolutionarily. Creatures that didn't sleep enough probably got weeded out over the millennia.
Right. Evolution doesn't keep anything around for no reason. If it's there, it's probably valuable, like your sense of taste or that painful reflex that prevents you from touching a hot stove more than once.
Or that comedic timing that some of us are just born with.
Yes, you do manage to deploy that well. Now, let's go further into the recommended tips Dr. Mercola provides, just to give folks a condensed blueprint. We've got 4 big ones. Keep a consistent schedule. Optimize the environment, dark, quiet, and cool. Watch your diet, including carbs and protein. Manage stress and wind down. Would you add anything else on top?
I think that about covers it. The only thing I'd reiterate is the no bright lights before bed. That includes not just overhead lighting, but also the tiny lights of phone screens, or even that glaring smartphone notification in the middle of the night.
Right. Because if your phone's constantly lighting up, your brain will interpret that as a sign that maybe it's time to wake up and check who's texting. That's the last thing you need at 2 a.m.
Precisely. Another subtle tip is to avoid intense emotional conversations right before bed. So, if you need to discuss that big looming family issue, maybe do it earlier in the day so you're not swirling in a mental tornado when you're trying to doze off.
Great advice. All this talk about sleep is making me realize how important it is to reevaluate my own habits. Late-night TV binges, random YouTube rabbit holes. Maybe I should consider a friendlier bedtime.
I always recommend a gentle reading session instead of screens. Or a warm bath if that's your style. Just something to calm the mind. After all, your mind is the main star of this show, orchestrating your memory, your immunity, your emotional state.
If we want to tie it back to Dr. Mercola's best-selling book, it's about cellular health at the end of the day. Sleep is arguably the biggest factor in letting your cells do their job. Repairing, restoring, re-energizing.
Exactly. When we talk about cellular wisdom, we're talking about how these small building blocks of life need the right environment to function optimally. And part of that environment is a good 8 hours of downtime, more or less.
That might be the simplest explanation for a complex phenomenon. Good sleep fosters healthy cells, which fosters a healthy you.
Right. And from a comedic standpoint, it's funny how we glorify hustle and productivity. Yet if we truly valued productivity, we'd sleep more. Because ironically, if you sleep better, you can be more efficient in your waking hours.
Precisely. It's a paradox that so many of us miss. Well, maybe these words will help nudge a few listeners to reevaluate.
Let's talk about the financial angle for a minute. One of the reasons Dr. Mercola emphasizes this as a public health issue is that billions of dollars in lost productivity can't be brushed aside. This affects national economies in a big way.
People come to work groggy, make mistakes, lose focus, produce subpar results. Multiply that by millions of individuals, and you have a formidable drain on resources.
So in a sense, by tucking yourself in early, you're also doing your civic duty.
That's a nice spin on it. Tuck in for the greater good. Might be the best piece of patriotism you can muster.
If only that were a recognized holiday. National Go-to-Bed-Early Day.
Let's imagine a big carnival for that. Except it would have to shut down by 8 p.m., so everyone could go to bed.
That might be the quietest carnival ever.
Speaking of quiet, noise pollution is another big barrier to good sleep. Some of us live in busy cities with honking horns or neighbors who keep the TV blasting. That's where earplugs, white noise apps, or better insulation can help.
Indeed. And if you can't manage any of those, maybe consider politely negotiating with your neighbor about their 2 a.m. karaoke sessions. But in all seriousness, prioritizing quiet can make a night and day difference.
Another dimension Dr. Mercola has mentioned is grounding or earthing, like stepping outside barefoot in uncontaminated natural environments, such as grass or the beach. Allegedly, this can reduce stress and help sync your rhythms.
Yes, though for many of us with city lives, that can be challenging. But if you have access to a beach or a clean, grassy area, it might help. The general idea is to connect to the Earth's electric field.
Interesting concept. Even if you're not fully sold on it, at least you get a peaceful moment outside in nature. That alone can calm your nerves.
Precisely. The big takeaway is that there's no single miracle trick. But a combined approach of consistent schedule, good environment, mindful dietary choices, stress reduction, and proper perspective on technology can transform your nights.
And in turn, transform your days. Let's also give a nod to the fact that it's not just about avoiding chronic issues. Good sleep can help us be more creative, kinder, and just more enjoyable people to be around.
Right? My comedic genius might well be fueled by 8 hours of solid rest. If I got only 4, you might see a much crankier version of me. And trust me, nobody wants that.
I'll stay clear of that timeline. Thanks. So, we've covered how Dr. Mercola's new bestseller ties into the fundamentals of cellular health, and how Dr. Matthew Walker's insights highlight that sleep is, in many ways, the single most beneficial daily habit.
We touched on the big statistic about flu risk, how national events might disrupt sleep, how genetically short sleepers are rare, and how ignoring your real sleep needs can come back to bite you, like a flu bug you never saw coming.
We talked about economic costs, emotional regulation, cognitive function, memory consolidation. Basically, every corner of the health puzzle is touched by sleep. I think that about covers the entire dreamscape.
Indeed. But I'd like to do a quick summary of Dr. Mercola's recommended strategies in my own comedic style, just for emphasis. Number 1. Keep your bedtime consistent. If you treat your bedtime like a variable that can shift at will, you're only shortchanging yourself.
Number 2. Make your room so dark you couldn't find a black cat wearing sunglasses in there if you tried. That's the level of darkness you want.
Number 3. If you're rummaging through the fridge at midnight, at least ensure your daytime meals provide balanced macronutrients, enough protein, moderate carbs, so you're not waking up hangry.
Number 4. Calm yourself before bedtime. That means no heavy drama or intense workouts right before you plan to doze off.
Exactly. And if you can incorporate a little morning sunlight or some grounding during the day, that's like topping up your body's circadian battery.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, as we wrap up, let's invite our listeners to consider that a well-rested version of themselves is not only healthier, but possibly more humorous, more creative, and definitely less likely to snap at random annoyances.
And who doesn't want that? We also want to remind everyone that if you want a deeper dive into these topics, Dr. Mercola's new bestseller on cellular health has plenty to say. It's a sign of the times that sleep is being recognized for its central role.
Right? Plus, it's not just about living longer, but living better. If we treat sleep like the essential resource it is, we might just find ourselves with better immunity, sharper brains, and bigger smiles.
Well said. I think that just about does it for today's episode of Dr. Mercola's Cellular Wisdom. I've been Alara Skye, the comedic voice of reason in the realm of natural health.
And I'm Ethan Foster, your friendly neighborhood observer, reminding you that the best way to become a superhero might be to get 8 hours of rest.
Thanks for joining us, and keep those eyes closed, folks, at least for a good chunk of your day, because as Dr. Walker said, and Dr. Mercola underscored, sleep might just be Mother Nature's best shot at immortality.
And on that note, sweet dreams, everyone. Stay well, stay curious, and we'll talk to you next time on Dr. Mercola's Cellular Wisdom.
Good night. Oh, wait. It might be morning as you listen. But in any case, catch those Z's when you can.
Indeed.